Welcome to Thalira Tales, where stories bloom in silence, carrying emotion, mystery, and hidden truth. Step in and let the tale unfold.
While I was 8 months pregnant at 11:47 p.m., I received a call from the police. Your husband is at the hospital. He is not alone. We found him with another woman. I drove there in the middle of the night, an eerie, unsettling silence all around. When I arrived, the doctor looked at me and said, "Ma'am, what you're about to see may shock you." He pulled the curtain back. I already knew what I was about to face. What they didn't know was that I had spent 6 months preparing for this exact moment. I'm so grateful you're here. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. I love knowing who's in this room with me. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements woven in for educational and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the message behind it? That one I mean entirely. I was sewing my son's name onto a white onesie when the call came. 11:47 p.m. a Friday, the last quiet moment of my life. The nursery smelled like fresh paint and cedar, the way new beginnings are supposed to smell. I had spent 3 weeks getting that scent right, 2 coats of warm gray on the walls. A cedar chest I'd refinished myself along the far wall, a mobile of hand-carved wooden birds that turned slowly above the crib whenever the heating vent breathed through the room. Everything in it had been chosen deliberately, the way you choose things when you understand that the details of a child's first world will shape the way he sees every world after. I was sitting in the nursing chair, a creamy linen glider I'd found at an estate sale in Franklin, and recovered myself with my feet up on the matching ottoman and the onesie stretched across my lap. My belly was enormous at 8 months round and heavy and strangely beautiful in the lamplight, and I had learned by then to balance things on top of it the way other people use a side table. The embroidery hoop rested against the curve of my stomach while my hands moved the needle through white cotton, pulling blue thread into the shape of a name. James. I had not told Preston the name yet. The lamp on the dresser threw a honey-colored light across the room. Outside the windows, Belle Meade was doing what it always did on a Friday night in October, sitting quiet and prosperous behind its stone walls and old magnolias unhurried by the rest of the world. We lived in one of the older homes on the street, a 1940s colonial that Preston had insisted on because of the address. I had come to love it for the wide front porch and the backyard oak and the way morning light came through the kitchen in long, clean streaks. I was prepared to stop loving it. I had been preparing for a number of things. The phone rang at 11:47. I didn't look at the number before I answered, a habit I rarely thought about until later. The voice on the other end was male-measured, carrying the particular flatness of someone trained to deliver difficult news without flinching. "Mrs. Caldwell." A brief pause. "This is Officer Weston with Nashville Metro Police. I'm sorry to reach you at this hour." I set the onesie carefully aside and straightened in the chair. My free hand moved without thinking to the curve of my belly, a reflex I had developed somewhere in the second trimester and never lost. "I'm listening," I said. "Your husband, Preston Caldwell, was found this evening at a residential address in Midtown Nashville. There was a fire at the property. He's been transported to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, treated for smoke inhalation and minor burns, but the attending physician says his condition is stable. They wanted next of kin notified." I waited. Something in the way he phrased it was careful in a way that meant there was more to come. "What caused the fire?" I asked. The pause was short, precise. "We're still investigating, ma'am, but I should let you know he wasn't alone at the property. There was a woman present. She's also been transported to Vanderbilt. I'd encourage you to come to the hospital when you're able." He wasn't alone. I let those 3 words sit in the air of the nursery for a moment. They didn't surprise me. That was the thing I would think about later. Driving through the dark, that my first response was not shock. It was something quieter. Something that felt almost like the last piece of a very long puzzle clicking into place. "Can you give me the address?" I asked. "The property where he was found." 4F. The Gulch Residences, 12 South. I already knew the address. I had known it for 3 months since the afternoon a man I trusted had slid a piece of paper across a coffee shop table and said, without drama, that Preston had been renting a furnished unit there under a corporate name he'd registered nearly 2 years ago. I had not confronted Preston about it. I had not said a word to anyone other than that one man. I had been waiting for the right moment, and I had been building quietly and carefully toward it ever since. The Thank you, Officer Weston, I said. My voice was level. I had been practicing levelness the way some people practice a second language out of necessity with discipline, until it stopped feeling like effort. I'll come in. I ended the call and sat still for a moment longer. The wooden birds above the crib turned in their slow, unhurried circle. The lamp hummed. My son shifted inside me, a long, rolling movement, the kind that had been waking me up for weeks, and then, as if he understood something, he went still. I pushed myself out of the chair the way you learn to at 8 months, leading with one arm, letting gravity work with you instead of against you. The familiar ache in my lower back flared as I stood, a dull, persistent percussion that had been my constant companion for the last 6 weeks. I breathed through it. I had gotten quite good at breathing through things. I looked at the onesie one last time. The name was only half finished, the last 2 letters still just pencil outline on the cotton, not yet thread, not yet real. I set it on the chair. I took my coat from the hook by the door. I picked up my bag. I did not make a list or sit down to compose myself or call anyone to say where I was going. I had been composed for months. There was nothing left to arrange. I did not lock the door when I left. I had somewhere far more important to be. 11 miles. That was all that separated me from the moment 6 months of careful, deliberate preparation had finally come to meet. I merged onto I-44-O without thinking, muscle memory, the route my body chose before my mind had finished deciding. Nashville at midnight in October is a particular kind of beautiful. The skyline catching its own light above the Cumberland, the highway stretching out ahead in 2 clean lines of amber and white. The rest of the city settling into the quiet that only comes after the last restaurants have turned their signs and the bars on Broadway are counting their registers. I drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and I let myself go back to where it had started. April, 6 months ago. It began the way these things usually do, with something small enough to explain away. Preston had always kept his phone close. That was nothing new. He ran a luxury automotive group with 43 employees across 2 Nashville locations, and the calls came at all hours. What changed in April was the angle of it. The phone stopped sitting face up on the nightstand the way it had for 11 years of our marriage. It started landing face down, every surface, every room, every time. A small adjustment, the kind a different woman in a different marriage might have filed under stress or habit. I noticed. I filed it under something else. The receipts came next. Preston had always been meticulous with the dealership's expense accounts. We had built the business together in the early years, and I knew the reporting system better than most of his employees. In May, the gaps started appearing. Dinners at restaurants I didn't recognize on evenings he said he was meeting fleet buyers. A hotel charge in Franklin billed to a manufacturer's conference that, when I looked it up, had taken place in Memphis that same weekend. A second phone line on the corporate account, registered under a name I'd never heard. The perfume was the last thing. Not an obvious cloud of it, nothing so careless. Just a thread of something floral and unfamiliar that I caught one Thursday evening when he hung his jacket on the hook by the door light, enough that he probably assumed I'd missed it. I had been married long enough to know that confrontation is not always the most powerful move available to you. I called Reed Calloway on a Tuesday morning in late April from a corner table at a coffee shop on Murphy Road, while Preston believed I was at a prenatal checkup across town. Reed and I had gone to Vanderbilt Law together 15 years ago. He had graduated and gone directly into criminal defense and financial crimes work. The kind of practice that requires you to understand in precise detail how people hide money, move assets across shell companies, and construct parallel lives that look from a reasonable distance, like ordinary ones. I hadn't spoken to him in 4 years. He picked up on the second ring. I told him everything I had found. I told him what I suspected. I told him I was 7 months pregnant and that I needed certainty before I said a single word to my husband, because once I said it, there was no taking it back, and I intended to be unassailable when the moment came. Reed called me back 11 days later. "He's moving money," he said without softening it. That was something I would come to rely on about Reed Calloway. He delivered information the way a good diagnostician delivers a test result. Clearly, without unnecessary cruelty but without cushioning either. Corporate accounts, joint savings, and a new LLC he registered 18 months ago under a name that isn't his. Whoever helped him structure it knows what they're doing. How much, I asked. Enough that it matters significantly in any legal proceeding. I had looked out the coffee shop window at the street for a moment. "We need to move soon," Reed said, "before the transfer's complete." "Not yet," I told him. "I need the full picture first. Every account, every name, every transaction. I want everything in hand before I do anything." A pause. Then, "That's a risk, Vivian. I know, I'm choosing it." What I hadn't told Reed yet was that the financial trail wasn't the only thing I was building toward. There were other patterns. I'd been watching a neighbor who seemed to know Preston's schedule better than any neighbor should. Conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. Small rearrangements in the texture of my daily life that felt less like coincidence and more like choreography. I was still assembling the pieces. I needed more time. What I had learned over 14 years of building a business and a marriage from the ground up was this: the person who moves first rarely wins. The person who waits until they have everything wins. I had been waiting, and I had nearly everything. The tightening moved across my midsection without warning, a Braxton Hicks contraction, the practice kind that Dr. Sandra Harmon, my OBGYN, had told me would become more frequent as I approached my due date. Unlike true labor contractions, Braxton Hicks are painless rehearsals, the body learning its own mechanics. I breathed through it the way Dr. Harmon had taught me: slow inhale for 4 counts, exhale for 6 shoulders deliberately down. The tightening peaked and released. James shifted once and was still. I kept my hands on the wheel. I kept driving. The towers of Vanderbilt University Medical Center came into view ahead. That sprawling complex of buildings and skywalks in the heart of Midtown, lit up even at this hour because hospitals don't close, don't dim, don't stop for the ordinary mechanics of night. I had been born in that building 43 years ago. Tonight it would be the setting for something else entirely. My phone buzzed against the center console. A text. Reed confirmed. "It's her. P2. Now." 3 sentences. The work of 6 months compressed into 11 words. I read it once. Put the phone face down deliberately the way Preston never did and pressed the gas. The automatic doors parted before I reached them. Vanderbilt University Medical Center's emergency entrance sits on Garland Avenue, set back from the main hospital complex behind a circular drive where ambulances pull in and out, regardless of the hour. I had walked through those doors exactly twice before that night, once for a broken wrist in my second year of law school, and once to visit a colleague whose wife had delivered 6 weeks early. Both times the building had given me the same impression, a quality of institutional calm that is not the same thing as peace. Hospitals at midnight have a silence all their own, not peaceful held. Like every person inside is collectively holding their breath, waiting for news to break one way or the other. The ER waiting area carried the smell that all emergency rooms carry: antiseptic layered over something older and more human, the kind that no industrial cleaning schedule can fully erase. The fluorescent lights ran at a frequency that made everything look slightly flattened, like a photograph taken with the wrong settings. The chairs were arranged in rows against pale walls, and the people in them sat the way people sit when they are trying to make themselves very small against very large things. I walked to the reception desk. The woman behind it had the practiced composure of someone who has fielded every variety of midnight crisis and stopped being surprised by any of them some years back. Her name tag read Donna. "My husband was brought in earlier tonight," I said. "Preston Caldwell." Donna's fingers moved to her keyboard without ceremony. "One moment." A brief scan of the screen. "He's in Bay 14 Wing C stable and under observation. The charge nurse will come out to speak with you." "Thank you." I stepped back from the desk and stood beside a rack of pamphlets about blood pressure management and annual flu vaccines, and I looked at the room. A man in his 60s sat with his elbows on his knees studying a point on the linoleum. A young woman in the far corner had fallen asleep, sitting up, her head tipped back against the wall. A boy of about 7 sat beside an older woman, his grandmother, I assumed, turning a small toy car over and over in his hands, the wheels spinning against his palm. Everyone in that room was waiting for someone else's story to resolve. I was the only one whose story had already resolved. I simply hadn't announced it yet. Nurse Dempsey came through the secured doors 2 minutes later, a compact woman in her mid-40s with short cropped gray hair and the efficient, unhurried walk of someone who had spent decades moving through tight corridors without wasting a single step. She shook my hand and confirmed what Donna had already told me. Preston was in Bay 14, Wing C stable. He had sustained minor injuries at the property, smoke inhalation, and superficial burns along his right forearm, and had been administered a mild analgesic for pain. He was conscious but not fully alert. "He's going to be all right," she said. The phrase had the quality of something said precisely and often, not dismissive factual. "I'm glad to hear that," I said, and then I asked the question I already knew the answer to. In the way you sometimes ask questions not because you need the information, but because the asking is itself a performance you have decided to give. "The woman who came in with him, is there anything you can tell me about her condition?" Nurse Dempsey's expression didn't change, but something in it settled the way a door settles into its frame when the latch catches. "I'm not able to share information about another patient," she said. "Federal privacy law HIPAA prohibits us from disclosing the identity or medical condition of any patient to a third party, including family members of other patients. It applies regardless of the circumstances." For any viewer wondering, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act enacted in 1996, is one of the most stringently enforced laws in American healthcare. It means that even confirming whether a specific person is present in a hospital can constitute a violation. Nurse Dempsey was not being evasive. She was doing exactly what the law required. "Of course," I said. "I understand completely." I did understand. I also didn't need her to tell me anything. I had known the woman's name for 3 months. I had known it the way you know something you've carried carefully. The way you know a word you've been holding on your tongue and not yet said aloud. What I didn't let Nurse Dempsey see was the strange discipline it required to stand in that hallway as the concerned wife, the worried, expectant mother, when I was also the woman who had spent half a year making sure that this night would not catch her unprepared. There is an exhausting precision to playing a role you've already outgrown. I was very good at it. I had needed to be. Dr. Whitfield arrived a few minutes after that, the ER attending physician. A lean man in his early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the particular economy of movement that long overnight rotations produce. He confirmed Preston's status in more clinical language, outlined the monitoring protocol, and asked if I had questions. I asked too. Not because I needed the answers, because I needed another 90 seconds before I could trust my peripheral vision again. The pulsing had started at the edges of my sight sometime during the conversation with Nurse Dempsey, that faint, rhythmic narrowing that arrives after sustained adrenaline followed by sudden stillness. I had felt something like it once before the morning I'd found the hotel receipt, standing in our kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, my body accounting for what my mind refused to slow down for. I thanked Dr. Whitfield, and as he turned toward the nurse's station, I walked to the row of chairs along the far wall and sat down. Not because I wanted to, because at 8 months pregnant, running on nothing but preparation and the particular cold clarity of a woman who has been waiting for a very long time for tonight to arrive, my body asked me to. Quietly, but without room for negotiation, I allowed myself 2 minutes. I counted them internally. I breathed with intention, slow and measured out the way doctor. Harmon had taught me and the way I had practiced in the parking garage 6 months ago when Reed first told me what Preston had been doing with our money. James pressed once against my ribs and went still, as though he too understood the value of a measured pause. Then I stood. I straightened my coat. I thanked Dr. Whitfield again on my way past the nurse's station, and I walked toward the parking structure. Reed was waiting in P2, and so was the truth, organized, documented, and ready to be delivered. P2 was colder than the hospital had been. Parking structures in Nashville have a particular quality at midnight. Concrete pillars absorbing the orange-tinged glow from fluorescent tubes that hum just below the threshold of hearing. The air carrying the cold, damp smell of motor oil and poured concrete, the kind of silence that arrives when most of the cars have gone home and left the space to its own geometry. My footsteps on the ramp echoed in a way that made me conscious of the distance between me and every other person in the building. Reed Calloway was standing beside a black sedan on the far side of the level, a leather briefcase resting on the hood, his hands in the pockets of his coat. He was taller than I had remembered from our law school years, or maybe I had simply forgotten how people look when a decade and a half of serious work has settled into them. His face, when he turned, had the contained expression of a man who understood that the wrong kind of emotion delivered at the wrong moment makes difficult situations harder. He had been my first call in April. He would be my last call tonight. They went in at 11:15, he said without softening it. Detective Marcus Greer, Nashville Metro Police Financial Crimes Unit, coordinated the entry. Greer has been building the criminal case alongside our civil work for the past 2 months. They had sufficient probable cause and a signed warrant. I had learned over 6 months of working with Reed that he gave information the way a good surgeon makes an incision with precision at the right depth, without unnecessary damage to surrounding tissue. I had come to find it useful. What did they find? I asked. He unlatched the briefcase. Apartment 4, F, the Gulch Residences on 12th Avenue South. Cash $2.4 million, mixed denominations already bundled. Property transfer documents, signed and notarized, moving 3 jointly held assets out of your name and into an entity that doesn't trace back to Preston in any obvious way. 2 passports. He paused. One of them isn't issued under the name she's been using in Nashville. And the woman. Reed looked at me directly. Celeste Drummond, he said. Unit 9 F Belmead Residences. I let the address arrive the way you let a piece of news arrive when you've been preparing for it, and it still hits harder than you expected. Not the name. Reed had sent that by text 40 minutes earlier, and I had already held it in my mind for the length of the drive and the walk through the ER and the conversation with Nurse Dempsey. The name I had managed. But the address, Unit 9, F. Belmead Residences, that was the specific detail that found a gap in my preparation. Unit 9F, 2 floors directly above my home. She had been living 2 floors above my son's nursery for 18 months. Every morning when I had stood at the kitchen window watching the light come in, she had been somewhere above my head. Every time I had stepped into the elevator with my coffee and my growing belly, she had already known exactly who I was, what I had, and what she intended to take from me. I exhaled once, slowly, deliberately. Tell me the rest, I said. Reed reached into the briefcase and removed 4 manila envelopes, each labeled in his precise handwriting. He had organized everything the way he organized everything, without flourish, with complete clarity about what each thing was and where it fit. He held out the first. Life insurance policy, $5 million taken out 3 months ago, insuring your life under Preston's name. The listed beneficiary is Drummond Holdings, LLC, a Delaware shell company. It traces to Celeste. He paused. Preston signed it, believing it was a collateral protection rider attached to the dealership expansion loan she helped him structure. It was buried on page 31 of a 47-page package. She handed him the stack during a busy afternoon. He signed. I took the envelope. A faint tremor moved through my fingers as I held it. Not fear, precisely, but the body's honest accounting of what $5 million with your name on it actually means, and I pressed it flat against my hip until my hand steadied. Second one. He passed it across. Lab results. The vitamin bottles recovered from her apartment tonight match the brand and packaging of your prenatal supplements exactly. The contents do not. The lab ran expedited analysis. No folate, no iron, no DHA, filler compound. She replaced your supplements with placebos, Vivian. 4 months of them. I received this information and put it in the same place I had been putting difficult information for 6 months carefully, with the intention of using it later in the right place, at the right time. The full weight of it I would feel when I could afford to. Not yet. The third envelope. Reed said, took the longest. Before Nashville, her name was Angela Marsh. We traced her through an insurance claim number attached to medical records from Memphis General Hospital 7 years ago. Insurance numbers are assigned at the federal level and don't change when a person changes their name or their state of residence. Most people who construct false identities don't account for that. He looked at me. She did something similar in Memphis in 2018. I've documented the parallel. And the fourth. He held it out. 18 months of emails and financial records, search history on Preston's dealership group, public revenue figures, LinkedIn activity business filings, property management records from Belle Meade residences, showing she specifically requested a unit on the 9th floor in the northeast-facing stack before she ever visited the property. She chose the building after she found Preston. She chose the floor after she found your unit number. I stood in P2 with 4 envelopes in my hands and thought about weight. They were lighter than they should have been. That was what struck me, how little it weighed. The full record of what had been planned and done and nearly completed. The kind of thing that changes the shape of a life, all of it contained in paper I could carry in one arm. I placed each envelope into my bag, carefully, in order. James pressed once against my ribs, a single definitive movement, and went still, as though he too understood that the time for preparation had passed. Reed? I settled the bag against my shoulder. When this is over and Greer has what he needs, I want the civil filings ready to move. They've been drafted for 3 weeks, he said. Good. I looked at him. I'm going in alone. He nodded. I'll be in the main lobby. Text me when you're ready for Greer. He's outside with the warrant. A pause. Take your time. Do it right. The corridor to Wing C was quieter than the main ER, the ambient noise of the waiting area replaced by the contained mechanical hum of monitoring equipment. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the occasional murmur of a staff conversation at the far end of the hall. Nurse Dempsey walked at a pace calibrated to the person behind her, and I matched it without effort. My bag settled against my hip, everything I needed distributed evenly across my shoulder. Bay 14. That was where they had put my husband. A curtain, a monitor, and 15 years of marriage reduced to a room number, written in black marker on a whiteboard beside a door. Dr. Whitfield was waiting outside Bay 14 when we arrived. He had been the one to confirm Preston's condition to me in the ER, the same economy of movement, the same reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. But his expression now was different. Not clinical. Careful. Mrs. Caldwell. He said my name the way physicians say names when they are about to add something to them. Before you go in, there is something I need you to be aware of. He paused. The corridor held its fluorescent quiet. The woman who was brought in alongside your husband is in the adjacent bay. Bay 15. Another pause. She asked that her presence not be disclosed. But given the circumstances, given who you are, I felt you had the right to know before you walked through that door. He looked at me directly. What you are about to see may be difficult. He reached to his left and drew back the curtain between Bay 14 and Bay 15. In American emergency wings, the bays are often separated not by solid walls, but by floor-to-ceiling curtain partitions, practical, movable. The kind of division that can be opened in seconds when the medical situation requires it. The curtain between 14 and 15 had been drawn nearly closed. Dr. Whitfield opened it perhaps 2 feet. No more than that. Enough. I saw her. Brown hair, the kind that catches overhead light and holds it slightly warm. A posture that communicated even in that brief exposure. The particular tension of someone very aware of their own containment. And the sweater, a deep teal blue, the specific shade that I had catalogued without meaning to. The color I had seen in the elevator at Belmead Residences on a Tuesday morning in July, and a Thursday afternoon in September, and a Sunday evening 2 weeks ago, when she had held the door for me with both hands and said, with the warmth of someone who has rehearsed warmth until it becomes indistinguishable from the real thing, that I looked wonderful, and wasn't I getting so close now? The same sweater. Worn 2 floors below where she had slept last night. Worn into a hospital where she had been brought alongside my husband on the night they had planned to leave the city together. She was looking at the opposite wall. She had not seen me. Dr. Whitfield drew the curtain closed. The 2 feet of visibility lasted perhaps 5 seconds. He said nothing further. He had done what he believed was right, in the only way the law permitted him to do it. Not a disclosure, not a statement, simply a fact made briefly visible and then covered again. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once and stepped back. I understood in that moment the difference between knowing and seeing, between carrying a truth in your mind, organized, documented, filed, and having it confirmed by your own eyes in a hospital corridor in the small hours of a Friday night. Knowing is the work of the mind. Seeing travels through something older and deeper, something that bypasses every careful preparation you have made and arrives at a place that preparation cannot reach. I had known her name for 3 months. I had known the apartment number, the shell company, the insurance policy, the placebos. I had been ready. None of that was the same as watching that teal blue sweater exist in real space 2 feet from where my husband slept. Nurse Dempsey paused outside Bay 14 and turned. "He's resting," she said. "The analgesic is still active. He may drift in and out, but his vitals are stable. If he becomes agitated, there's a call button on the left rail." She pushed the door open. The room was dim, a single panel of light above the bed, the green pulse of the cardiac monitor. The particular hush that settles over a space where someone is being managed by medication and circumstance. I went in. Preston lay on the bed to the right of the entrance, his right forearm wrapped in a clean white bandage where the burn had been treated. Faint redness still visible along the edge of the dressing. The hospital gown was standard issue, too loose at the shoulders. He looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe it was only that beds like this, flat and institutional, and stripped of every ordinary detail, have a way of reducing people to the outline of themselves. His chest moved in the slow, even rhythm of medicated sleep. His hands were open at his sides. His mouth was slightly parted. I stood at the foot of the bed and looked at him. 15 years. I had slept beside this face for 15 years. Had pressed my palm to his jaw on winter mornings when he was warm and the room was cold. Had watched the slow arithmetic of middle age settle into the lines around his eyes. The gray threading through at his temples in a way I had always thought made him look more like the man I'd married, not less. I had believed I knew every version of this face, the tired one, the distracted one, the one that appeared on Sunday mornings when he hadn't had coffee yet, and the world hadn't claimed him. The version in front of me, now unguarded, diminished, familiar in structure and foreign in meaning, was one I didn't recognize. It was the face of a stranger I happened to have shared a bed with for a decade and a half. "Would you like a chair?" Nurse Dempsey asked from behind me. "Yes. Thank you." My voice caught just barely the fraction of a second where the phrase "my husband" would have required more steadiness than I had available, and then I had it back. Pulled tight again, the way you pull a coat closed against wind. She moved a chair without comment. The professional discretion of someone who has witnessed too many variations of this particular moment to react to any of them. I sat. I set the bag on my lap and did not open it yet. James shifted a slow, arching movement beneath my ribs, less a kick than a repositioning. I pressed my palm flat against the side of my abdomen. Not for comfort. As confirmation. We were still here. Both of us still intact. Nurse Dempsey said she would check back in 30 minutes and left through the door. I sat in the dimness with Preston's slow breathing and the monitor's unwavering green line, and I waited for something to arrive, some version of grief or rage, or the feeling people describe when they say their heart broke. What came instead was the same operational clarity that had been running underneath everything since 11:47. The part of me that had built toward this night steadily and without announcement had no room for grief yet. That particular accounting would come later, but not here, not in Bay 14. At 12:40 in the morning, I turned back to Preston. I looked at his face the way you look at a diagnosis you have received and already accepted. Searching now not for the answer, but for the adjustment your body needs to make to the new geometry of your life. I opened my bag. I arranged the envelopes in the order I would use them, and I settled in to wait for him to wake up with everything I needed already in my hands and nowhere left to be, but here. The monitor read 12:58 when Preston first moved. Not dramatically. No sudden awakening. No sharp intake of breath the way it happens in films. Just a shift in the rhythm of his chest, a small recalibration. The body finding its way back from the edge of medicated quiet the way it does when a mild analgesic loses its purchase. His right hand flexed once against the sheet. Then his head turned slowly, toward the chair where I had been sitting for the past 20 minutes, and his eyes opened. They found me immediately. There is a number that can change the meaning of everything that came before it. Not just the events, the meaning, the context, the way an entire period of your life gets retroactively reclassified. For me, that number was $5 million. But I am getting ahead of myself. For a moment, Preston only looked at me. His eyes had the unfocused quality that mild sedation produces, present but not yet fully organized. The expressions behind them assembling themselves in the wrong sequence. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that moved through several intermediate states too quickly before arriving, messily at what looked like relief. He should have known better than to start there. Vivian. His voice was rough, the word catching on dryness and whatever the analgesic had left behind in his throat. He shifted on the bed and the sound he made low, involuntary, the kind that exits before a person can decide whether to contain it, told me exactly where the bandaged arm and the rawness in his chest from the smoke were making themselves known. He stopped moving. God. Okay. A careful breath. Vivian, let me Don't, I said. He stopped. Not yet, I said. I reached into my bag and removed the first envelope. I set it on the edge of the bed within his reach, but not placed in his hands. An important distinction. I wanted him to choose to pick it up. You signed this 6 weeks ago, I said. It was on page 31 of the documentation packet for your dealership expansion loan. The heading on that page reads, Collateral Protection Agreement. I paused. That is not what it is. Preston looked at the envelope the way sales directors look at things they haven't yet decided how to respond to, measuring it, reading the room, giving himself a half-second more than he needed. Then he picked it up, opened it, withdrew the document inside. I watched him read. The silence in Bay 14 was the specific silence of a cardiac monitor and a man encountering for the first time a document he believed he had already understood. He went through the first page at the pace of someone reading carefully. Then the second page, where the relevant number lived. $5 million. My name in the insured field. The beneficiary designation on the line below it, Drummond Holdings LLC, registered in the state of Delaware. His face changed. Not gradually, all at once, the color draining in a way that had nothing performative about it. This was not the expression of a man caught in something he knew about. This was the expression of a man who had just found a room in his own house that he didn't know existed and understood immediately what it contained. "This isn't," he started. "Keep reading," I said. He did. The monitor kept its pace. I kept mine. When he lowered the document, he did not look at me the way he had when he first opened his eyes. The relief was gone. What replaced it was something more honest. "I don't understand this," he said. "She told me this was a standard rider, that any commercial real estate package above a certain loan value required collateral protection insurance. She said it was a formality." "She handed you the stack during the dealership expansion signing," I said. "That afternoon you had 3 calls running simultaneously. She walked you through each section verbally. You trusted her explanation." I let that settle before I continued. "That's documented, Preston. The timing, the calls, the specific language she used to describe page 31. All of it." He looked at the document again, at the beneficiary line. "Drummond Holdings, LLC," he said. The name of his own company, the automotive group Caldwell Automotive, was a familiar shape in his mouth. This one was not. "Delaware. Delaware LLCs are commonly used to obscure ownership," I said, for the benefit of anyone who might later wonder, and because explaining it to Preston was in that moment simply accurate. "The state requires minimal disclosure about who controls or benefits from a Delaware-registered entity, which is why people who want to hide themselves behind a corporate name choose it." I looked at him directly. "The entity traces to Celeste Drummond. Reed Calloway confirmed it 9 days ago." Preston set the document down on the sheet in front of him. He looked at it without touching it, the way you look at something you can't make sense of and can't stop trying to. "This isn't an affair," he said. The words came out quietly, almost to himself, the realization arriving in his voice a few seconds after it had clearly arrived in his understanding. "No," I said. "She was going to—" He stopped. The sentence had a destination he couldn't seem to make himself arrive at out loud. "Yes," I said. "She was." I felt no satisfaction watching Preston Caldwell understand what the woman he had been sleeping with for 8 months had actually been doing while they were doing it. I want to be accurate about that. Satisfaction would have required a simpler version of events than the one I had been living inside for 6 months. What I felt was something colder and more useful, the particular clarity that comes when a half-known truth finally becomes a completely documented one. The clarity of a woman who has had 6 months to grieve the marriage and has arrived at this hospital room with only the work left to do. I reached back into my bag. "Before I show you what was inside that vitamin bottle, the thing that made me go completely cold when I read the lab report, drop the number 7 in the comments right now, just so I know you're still with me. A note: portions of this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes and may not reflect events exactly as they occurred. If that's not the content you're here for, this is a natural place to step away, no judgment at all. I am not a woman who breaks easily. This is not vanity. It is simply a fact about my own architecture, one I have tested under various circumstances over 43 years and found to hold." When I held the second envelope up and looked at what it contained, something cracked open inside me. Not loudly, not in any way Preston could have seen or any monitor would have registered, but it cracked. And what came through the fracture was something I couldn't name until much later, sitting in a different room in a different city with my son asleep against my chest. The envelope contained 2 items: a sealed evidence bag with a vitamin bottle inside and a single-page forensic lab analysis on Nashville Metro Police letterhead, stamped with an expedited processing notation, the kind of report that gets fast-tracked when detectives working an active criminal case need results the same night. The bottle was wrapped in clear plastic evidence packaging, but through it the label was perfectly legible. Pranavit Complete. 3rd trimester formula. The exact brand and product Dr. Sandra Harmon, my OBGYN, had recommended at my 24th week appointment in June. The same brand I had been taking every morning with a glass of water and a quiet, reliable faith that it was doing what it claimed to do. The label on the bottle in the evidence bag was identical in every respect to the label on the bottle in my medicine cabinet at home. The police recovered this from her apartment tonight, I said. My voice was level. I had decided sometime in the past 6 months that level was the only register available to me. Same brand, same packaging, same lot number on the base. I set the lab sheet on the bed beside the insurance document. The contents are not the same. I looked at Preston while I read from the analysis. Sugar filler, a binding compound. Calcium carbonate, the inert ingredient used to give a capsule its proper weight and texture so that it feels identical to the real thing in your hand when you shake 2 into your palm every morning. I heard my own voice from a slight remove. The way you hear yourself say something your body has understood before your mind has quite finished processing it. No folate, no iron, no DHA. I will explain this precisely because precision is what this deserves. Folate, also called folic acid, is essential for preventing neural tube defects during fetal development, including conditions that affect the brain and spine. Iron supports the mother's blood volume and the fetal oxygen supply. The body stores iron as ferritin, which is why OBGYNs test ferritin levels at routine appointments. DHA, an omega-3 fatty acid, is critical for fetal brain and eye development, particularly in the 3rd trimester, when neural development accelerates most rapidly. Remove all 3 from a pregnant woman's daily supplement for 4 consecutive months, and you do not produce an immediate catastrophe. You produce a sustained, invisible deficiency that compounds quietly in her body and the body of the child she is carrying, measurable on lab work, undetectable by feeling. In August, I said, at my 28-week appointment, Dr. Harmon reviewed my blood work and noted that my ferritin levels were lower than they should have been for this stage of pregnancy. She asked about my diet and whether I was taking my supplements consistently. I paused. I told her yes, every morning without exception. She suggested I increase my red meat intake and come back in 3 weeks for a follow-up panel. The room was very quiet. I ate more red meat. I bought a second brand of vitamins and doubled up. I reduced my exercise schedule because I thought the fatigue was related. I blamed my own body for 4 months. I set the lab sheet down precisely. I thought I was doing something wrong. Preston had not spoken. He was looking at the lab results with the expression of a man who has stopped trying to manage the situation and is simply absorbing what the situation is. She had a copied key. I said. Reed traced the records through the building management office. A second key for our unit was logged in March, around the time the building switched to a new lock system. The request was submitted under your name. You didn't submit it. I watched that land. For a moment, Preston said nothing. Then he pressed one hand flat against his face, covering his eyes the bridge of his nose, and stayed very still. He was not crying. He was doing what people do when they need to be inside a feeling before they can begin to find words for it. I had done the same thing alone in the parking garage at Reed's office in September, after the lab confirmed what the first preliminary analysis had suggested. James, he said. Just the name. The name he didn't know I had chosen but said correctly anyway, because it was the name I had been whispering to my son for 3 months, and somehow it had gotten into the air of the apartment we shared. She could have... Yes, I said. The tightening moved across my lower abdomen without warning that long, slow band of pressure that arrives when the uterus rehearses what it will eventually need to do in earnest. I stopped. I set my hand flat against the side of my belly and breathed the way Dr. Harmon had taught me, 4 counts in, 6 counts out. The contraction peaked, held, and released. James shifted beneath my ribs, one deliberate movement. 10 seconds. Then it passed. I turned toward the partial partition on my left. The wall between Bay 14 and Bay 15 was not solid. At this hour, with the corridor quiet and the equipment providing its neutral background hum, sound carried through the partition with a clarity I had been counting on since I walked in. I spoke at a normal volume, quietly. Restraint, I had learned, travels further than volume. My son almost came into this world with a folate deficiency, I said. Not to Preston, to the space beyond the wall, to the woman in the teal blue sweater. 2 feet of partition and several lifetimes of choices away from where I was sitting. Because someone I trusted touched my belly and asked me what names I liked while she was making sure those supplements were doing nothing for him. I let it arrive wherever it was going to arrive. I want you to remember this moment, I said. Whatever comes next, every room you walk into for the rest of your life, I want this room to be the one you remember. I turned back to Preston. From behind the partition, I heard a sound. Small, involuntary. The kind that escapes before a person can decide whether to suppress it, the sound of someone who has just understood, completely and without the possibility of revision, that the trap they were standing in has already closed around them. Exactly that. The aftermath of what I had said toward the partition settled over Bay 14 like weather, the particular atmospheric shift of a room in which something significant has just occurred and everyone present is adjusting to the new pressure. Preston had not spoken since I finished. The monitor marked his heartbeat with its green steadiness. I sat with my hands in my lap and waited for the next move, which I already knew was coming. It came at 1:14 in 2 parts. The first was Nurse Dempsey, through the door with her tablet, and the efficient quiet of an overnight staff member managing a full wing on a Friday. She checked the monitor readings, entered a note, and assessed the room with the professional neutrality of someone trained to see a situation accurately without inserting herself into it. Preston watched the ceiling. I sat without moving. "Everything looks good," she said to Preston in the register reserved for patients rather than visitors. "Try to get some rest. I'll check back in 20 minutes. She paused at the door, the particular hesitation of a person who has sensed something in a room's atmosphere without being able to name it, and then she left. The door settled into its frame. The corridor outside held its quiet. The second part came from Bay 15. It was not a shout, and it was not a whisper. It was pitched at the specific volume of someone who needs to be heard through a wall but cannot afford to sound like she is trying. A voice that had likely been very practiced at sounding like whatever it needed to sound like, arriving now at something stripped of that practice, at something close to its actual register. "Tell her." A pause. "Tell her I'm pregnant. It's Preston's child." I watched Preston close his eyes. Not in surprise. In the exhaustion of a man who has received in the space of 15 minutes more information than he can manage, and has just been handed more. I understood the closing of those eyes. I did not share it. I had thought about this moment specifically, on the drive-in in the parking garage in the chair while Preston slept. When a person with nothing left reaches for a final claim, something they believe cannot be immediately disproved, that claim almost always takes one of two forms: money or a child. Celeste had already lost the money in the parking garage in 4 envelopes passed between Reed and me under fluorescent lights. That left the child. I reached into my bag and removed the third envelope. "Reed hired an identity tracing firm," I said. Preston opened his eyes. "A licensed agency that specializes in locating individuals who have altered their legal documentation. The method they used in this case was an insurance claim number. In the United States, claim numbers are assigned by insurers and tracked at the federal level, linked to the individual's social security record, not their legal name. When someone changes their name, the name on file updates. The number does not." I set the envelope on the bed and opened it. Reed's firm found a medical record attached to her insurance claim number at Memphis General Hospital. The record is dated 7 years ago. The name on it is not Celeste Drummond. I removed the first document, a photostat of the surgical record facility code and physician license number visible in clean institutional type. Bilateral tubal ligation. A permanent surgical procedure in which the fallopian tubes are blocked cut or sealed, preventing eggs from reaching the uterus. The procedure is considered irreversible under standard medical classification. A woman who has undergone it cannot achieve pregnancy through natural means. I set it on the bed beside the insurance document and the lab analysis. The attending physician's credentials and Memphis General's registered facility identifier are both listed on the record. It is verifiable. Then I remove the second item from the envelope. A photograph taken by Nashville Metro evidence technicians inside apartment 4F, the Gulch residences during the police entry. The photograph showed a silicone prosthetic, a form-fitted abdominal insert skin-toned manufactured to simulate a third trimester pregnancy. It had been found in the master bathroom drawer, inside a cloth-carrying case beneath a folded hand towel. I placed it on the bed. Preston looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at it the way people look at things that rearrange the meaning of other things, working backward through memory, applying the new information to the old images, understanding that a substantial portion of what he had believed about the past 8 months had been constructed for him, with a great deal of care by someone who had understood exactly what he needed to believe in order to keep cooperating. He had believed she was pregnant. I understood that. It explained the passports. It explained the accelerated timeline on the asset transfers. A man who had convinced himself he was running towards something, a child, a future, rather than simply away from the one he already had. The photograph on the bed in front of him was dismantling all of that silently without requiring me to say a word. I let him have the moment. Then I turned toward the partition. The procedure was performed at Memphis General. I said, clearly, without raising my voice above the register of ordinary conversation, because the wall between Bay 14 and Bay 15 did not require volume-only clarity. 7 years ago, under your real name, from Bay 15 silence, not the involuntary small sounds that had preceded this, not the controlled silence of someone choosing not to respond. The silence that follows the last card being set on the table, the specific quiet of a person who has arrived at the end of the available moves and is standing in the space where the next one should be, finding nothing there. I turned back to Preston. I collected the documents and stacked them carefully with the others. Then I looked at the partition one final time. I have been holding a name all night, I said to whatever remained of the attention on the other side of that wall. The one that belongs to you before Nashville, before Belmead, before every conversation we had in the elevator about my son. I paused. Angela Marsh. The name held in the room for a moment after I said it. Not dramatically, names don't actually echo whatever literature suggests. But Angela Marsh occupied the air of Bay 14 in the specific way that a true name does after a false one has been in use for long enough, with the weight of something that has finally been returned to its correct location. I turned back to Preston. After the identity tracing firm found the medical record, I said, Reed went further. He retained a private investigator in Memphis who specializes in historical case research, court filings, property records, local reporting. The insurance number didn't just connect to a surgery, it connected to a family. I had thought about how to tell this part. The previous night, sitting at the kitchen table after Preston had gone to bed with Reed's summary on my laptop and the fourth envelope open in front of me, I had considered the question of what the correct amount of information was, how much to say in what sequence to whom. I was Vivian Caldwell, 8 months pregnant, telling her husband the truth about the person he had been sleeping with. I was also the narrator of everything that had happened to my family over the past 18 months. Narrators make choices. I chose to tell him everything. In 2018, in Memphis, Tennessee, there was a family, I said. My voice was unhurried. The facts had enough weight on their own. A married couple. He ran a property management company. She was a high school counselor, 29 weeks pregnant with their first child. I watched Preston not to gauge his reaction exactly, but to ensure he was listening at the depth the information required. A woman operating under the name Dana Callum moved into a rental property managed by the husband. Over approximately 6 months, she established a personal relationship with him. Financial manipulation, a fabricated pregnancy claim, escalating access to his business accounts. The pattern was identical to the one she used here, not similar. Identical. Preston had not moved. He was sitting in information that had outpaced his ability to generate a response the way he had been twice before that night. I noticed that he had stopped looking for a way out of the conversation. Something had shifted in his posture, the quality of a person who has stopped managing a situation and has begun simply receiving it. The husband was prosecuted, I said. He was convicted on 3 counts of financial fraud transactions that Angela had structured and that he had authorized without understanding their true nature. He received an 8-year sentence. He is currently serving year 6 at a correctional facility in Western Tennessee. I paused. The wife lost the baby. I said it plainly. It deserved to be said plainly. She was in her 7th month when the arrest happened. The medical documentation from Memphis General describes the cause of delivery as acute maternal stress. The clinical classification for what occurs when the body's sustained stress response becomes severe enough to interfere with the physiological systems supporting a pregnancy. She had discovered what her husband was involved in, watched him arrested, and spent the following months attending hearings and managing a public prosecution while pregnant and without income. I kept my voice even. She delivered at 31 weeks. The baby did not survive. The monitor marked Preston's heartbeat with its indifferent green certainty. Her name is Karen, I said. She lives in Collierville now, east of Memphis. She teaches 6th grade. A breath. I called her last month. Preston looked at me directly for the first time in several minutes. I found her through the prosecution file. It's a matter of public record in Tennessee. I called because I wanted to understand what I was dealing with from someone who had dealt with it before I had. And because she deserved to know that someone had found the trail Angela left, and that the trail had led somewhere. There was a silence in which I could hear through the partition the particular quality of absolute stillness, not the involuntary sounds that had come before, and not the strategic silence of someone choosing not to speak. The stillness of a person on the other side of a thin wall who is hearing their own history narrated in someone else's voice, in precise detail with documentation to support it. That conversation lasted 40 minutes, I said quietly. Karen spoke for most of it. She had been waiting 6 years for someone to call who already knew enough to ask the right questions. By the end, she said only one other thing that I am going to repeat to you now. I let the pause find its own length. She said she hoped Angela had finally met someone who was paying attention. Preston closed his eyes. What moved across his face this time was not shock, not the blanching of the insurance document, or the controlled collapse of learning about the silicone prosthetic. It was something older and quieter. The expression of a man who has spent 8 months believing he was in some sense the author of the situation he was in, that the choices he had made had at least been his choices, and who has just understood that he was a supporting character in a story written before he arrived, one that would have found its next chapter with or without him. He had not known what he was involved in. I believe that. It didn't absolve him of what he did know: the affair, the asset transfers, the willful blindness that is its own variety of culpability. But there is a distinction between a man who is deceived and a man who deceives, and I had needed that distinction to be clear in my own mind before I could be clear about anything else. I became aware of my legs the way you become aware of them when they have been patient with you past a reasonable limit, a low, insistent ache from the knee down. The accumulated cost of an hour of sustained tension in a body already carrying more than its ordinary weight. I pressed one hand to the bed rail for a single second, a small, private concession to the fact that I was 43 years old, 8 months along, and had not sat still since 11:47. Then I reached into the bag one final time. The 4th envelope, the emails, the floor plan requests, the financial searches that predated by 18 months the afternoon Celeste Drummond had appeared at our building association meeting with a bottle of wine and an interest in getting to know the neighbors. I set it on the nightstand beside the bed. When you're ready to understand the full picture, I said, it's in there. Everything. I pulled the chair back to its position and sat down, settled the bag on my lap. Take your time, and I waited for what came next. What I was waiting for took 11 minutes. Preston reached for the 4th envelope at 1:36. Not with the decisive motion of a man making a choice, the slower movement of someone who has exhausted alternatives and understands it. He opened the flap, withdrew the documents inside, and began to read. I recorded her in my own living room, my house, my rules, my evidence, and in the state of Tennessee, every word of it perfectly, unassailably legal. This requires a brief explanation, because legality here is not incidental. It is the reason the recordings will hold in court. And it is the reason I made them instead of confronting Celeste directly when I first began to understand what she was doing. Tennessee is a one-party consent state. Under Tennessee Code, annotated Section 39-13-601A, conversation can be lawfully recorded as long as at least one participant in that conversation consents to the recording. When Celeste Drummond sat on my sofa, accepted the coffee I made her, and spoke in my home, I was a participant in every one of those conversations. I consented to the recording. The device I installed in August, a commercially available audio recorder, the kind used by journalists and investigators, and anyone else who needs a clear record of what was actually said, sat on the third shelf of my living room bookcase and recorded everything for 11 consecutive weeks. 14 conversations. 6 of them contained material directly relevant to the conspiracy. I had installed it on the 12th of August, the morning after I called Reed, and described to him the specific pattern of things that had been accumulating since spring. The questions Celeste asked about Preston's business, precise questions, the kind that assumed a level of knowledge she had no ordinary reason to have. The timing of her visits, which corresponded with Preston's absences in a frequency that was difficult to attribute to coincidence. The way her hands moved over objects in my apartment when she thought my attention was elsewhere, the hands of someone who is assessing a space, rather than inhabiting it. Reed had walked me through the applicable statute that same evening. I had driven to an electronic supply store in Green Hills the following morning and purchased the device. While Celeste was at a yoga class, I knew her Tuesday schedule from the building's shared activity calendar, a resource Belle Meade Residences made available to all residents as a community convenience that had on this particular occasion worked in my favor. I had sat in my car in the parking lot afterward and held the device in my hand for a moment. A small rectangle of black plastic and circuit board, lighter than it had any right to be given what I was asking it to do. I was going to record my neighbor in my living room. I was going to do it legally, carefully, and without remorse. The thought arrived without drama and stayed that way. I had already passed the point where this surprised me about myself. By September, Reed had the 6 relevant recordings transcribed and analyzed. The material was unambiguous. In one conversation from late September, a Thursday evening, during what Celeste had framed as a casual visit to deliver a recipe she had promised me weeks earlier, she made 4 statements constituting direct evidence of conspiracy to commit financial fraud. In 2 additional recordings, she discussed asset transfer timing in sufficient detail that Reed's cross-reference against Preston's actual transaction records showed an accuracy of within 48 hours. In a third, she outlined the Montreal Plan in terms that left no meaningful room for interpretation. Reed submitted the full set of recordings and transcriptions to Nashville Metro Police Financial Crimes Unit on the morning of October 9th, 48 hours before tonight. Preston had been reading for several minutes. The transcripts ran 12 pages. I watched his eyes move across them without interruption, the pace slowing as he reached the later pages, where the language became specific in the way that specificity becomes audible when someone speaking to a friend in a living room believes themselves entirely unobserved. He set the final page on top of the others. The silence in Bay 14 was the silence of a man who has just read in someone else's words the full shape of the thing he was inside. She was going to... He started. Yes, I said. He looked at me. The next sentence formed somewhere behind his expression and stopped before it reached his voice. And I was... Yes, I said. Nothing more was required. The answer was yes to both incomplete sentences and everything between them. The instrument, the mechanism, the name on the policy, and the signature on the transfers. Whether he had understood his role or only played it was a question the legal system would address in its own time. That question was no longer mine to answer. Reed Calloway is not only my attorney, I said. He has been coordinating with Detective Marcus Greer of Nashville Metro Financial Crimes for the past 2 months. The recordings were submitted to Greer's unit 48 hours ago. The arrest warrant issued for Celeste Drummond, named in the warrant under her legal identity as Angela Marsh, was signed by a Nashville judge yesterday afternoon at 2:15. Preston looked at the documents spread across the hospital sheet. The insurance policy, the lab analysis, the Memphis medical record, the silicone prosthetic photograph, and now 12 pages of transcript in which the woman he had planned to leave the country with had described in her own voice exactly what she had intended to happen to me. "Is there anything you want to say to me?" I asked, "before this becomes a matter of official record." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Then something moved through his expression, not the calculated response of the salesman I had watched work a room for 15 years, but something underneath that, something that had less practice and more truth in it. "I'm sorry," he said, 2 words plainly without qualification or maneuver. "I received them." I did not reply. My phone buzzed against the bag on my lap. "Reed Greer is outside. Say the word." I read it once. Then I looked at Preston, the full length of him in the hospital bed, the bandaged arm. The documents arranged across the sheet like the record of a life being formally concluded. And I committed the image to whatever part of memory stores the things you need to be finished with. Not with hatred, not with grief, not yet. With the clear-eyed finality of a woman who knows exactly what she is leaving behind. I typed 3 letters. "Now." I put the phone in my bag, stood up, and walked toward the door with everything I had come in carrying. Before I tell you what happened when Detective Greer walked into that hospital corridor, type "I'm here" in the comments. Because what comes next is the moment 6 months of everything finally landed exactly where it was supposed to. A note: this story contains elements that have been fictionalized for educational and narrative purposes. Names, locations, and certain details are not intended to represent any specific individual. If this isn't the content for you, now is the moment to step away. The corridor in Wing C looked the same as it had when I walked through it the first time. The same pale institutional walls, the same fluorescent panels running in even intervals overhead. The same faint squeak of shoe soles on linoleum. What was different now was the weight in it. The weight of people with authority and purpose moving through a space that had just become, officially and irrevocably, the site of a criminal arrest. Detective Greer walked like a man who had done this 100 times. Not because he was indifferent to it. I could see from where I stood in the doorway of Bay 14 that he was not, but because he was someone for whom the arrest of a person is a professional event, approached with the same precision and economy of motion that a surgeon brings to a procedure, repeated until it holds no surprises. 2 officers flanked him, both plainclothes, both carrying the specific posture of people operating within a legal authority they have no need to announce. They were met at the Wing C entry by a hospital security officer. A compact man in a gray uniform who had been briefed when the warrant situation was communicated to hospital administration earlier that evening. In an American hospital, law enforcement executing a valid arrest warrant and hospital security work in coordination. The hospital's priority is protecting the stability of the ward and the privacy of uninvolved patients, and they provide guidance to incoming officers to execute the process with minimum disruption. The security officer exchanged something brief with Greer. Greer nodded, once gestured to his right, Bay 15. I stayed in the doorway of Bay 14 and watched. Reed appeared from the direction of the elevators a minute later, moving with the economy of a man who had received my text and spent the intervening time in motion rather than deliberation. He carried his briefcase and his bar credentials and the contained calm of an attorney who has coordinated the consequential parts of an evening in advance and is present now only for its execution. A hospital administrator in a blue lanyard appeared beside him within 30 seconds. Reed produced his documentation, She reviewed it, assessed the scene, the officers, the warrant. The corridor of a wing that had been quietly transformed over the past 90 minutes into the setting for something more significant than its fluorescent lighting, suggested and made the reasonable decision that most people in her position make when law enforcement and legal representation converge in the same hallway. She let him through. Reed took a position near the wall, equidistant between the two bays within sightline of both and obligated to neither. His eyes met mine briefly across the corridor. Nothing passed between us that needed to. 6 months of preparation tends to reduce communication to essentials. I stayed where I was. Through the partial partition, the thin wall that had carried my voice to Bay 15 three times in the past hour, I heard the door open. Then Detective Greer's voice, clear and measured, reading the words that American law requires at this specific moment: the right to remain silent, the right to counsel the advisement that anything said may be used in a court of law. Miranda rights. The words are the same in every case, every room, every arrest, because the system designed them to be. They sounded different in real life than in any recording. More deliberate, slower, as though the law itself understands the weight of the moment and paces itself accordingly. What I felt listening to those words spoken in the bay adjacent to the one where my husband was lying with 12 pages of transcript on his bed was something I had not expected. A kind of release so quiet it was almost inaudible. 6 months of building had led to 47 seconds of Miranda rights read through a hospital partition. That was how justice moved, not in crescendo, in procedure. The door to Bay 15 opened again. She came into the hallway ahead of the two officers' wrists secured in front of her. The hospital identification bracelet visible on her left arm alongside the clasp of a watch that had endured the evening more intact than its owner. She was still wearing the blue sweater, the deep teal that I had catalogued in my elevator on ordinary mornings that had been visible to me for 5 seconds when Dr. Whitfield drew back the curtain in the corridor outside Bay 15. That had been the last confirmation I needed before everything I already knew became something I had seen with my own eyes. Under the corridor lighting, it appeared darker than memory had rendered it, smaller. She appeared smaller than I had assembled her in my mind over 18 months of documents recordings and the slow, methodical process of understanding what had been done to my family. She had not been crying. I noted that the way I had noted most things about her over the preceding 6 months as data. Whatever the past hour had required of her in Bay 15, it had not broken her composure, because her composure was not the kind that breaks under pressure. It was the kind that hardens. She walked with the posture of someone who is in custody and has made a deliberate choice about what that posture communicates. She saw me when she reached the center of the corridor. She stopped. The officers allowed it the way experienced officers allow a held moment that is clearly neither flight nor resistance, the human pause before the procedural resumption of the world. She looked at me. Not up, not down. Directly. With eyes that contained no appeal and no performance of remorse, no calculation of how this might yet be managed. Only the particular cold that belongs to a person who has been found out completely and has decided that the one remaining thing available to them is their refusal to display what they feel. She looked at me the way a predator looks at the thing that ended the hunt. I did not look away. I am not a woman who looks away. My legs were trembling just below the knees, in the place where it is least visible, where the body is most honest about what it is carrying. I was aware of them. I pressed my shoulder harder against the doorframe of Bay 14 and held the position. 8 months pregnant. An hour and 50 minutes past midnight. 45 minutes past the moment I had been building toward for 6 months. The trembling was not fear. It was the body accounting for itself, insisting on its own reality after being asked to carry something very heavy for a very long time. She walked past me. At the last moment, just before the pace of the officers resumed and the rest of the corridor claimed her, she turned her head back in my direction and said something. Low, without the officers reacting, intended only for me. I will not repeat it. Not to read, not to anyone who might ask me in the years after. Not because it found what it was aiming for, because in 8 words or fewer, it confirmed with complete precision everything I had spent 6 months documenting about what Celeste Drummond actually was, underneath every version of herself she had ever assembled for a room. Some things are more useful as confirmation than as quotation. After Greer left with Celeste Bay, 14 went quiet in a way that had a different quality than any of the silences that had come before it. Not the held breath of a hospital at midnight. Not the operational quiet of the past 90 minutes. Something more final than either. The silence of a space where the consequential thing has already happened, and what remains is only its aftermath waiting to find its shape. Just Preston, just me, and everything we weren't going to be anymore. He had shifted while I was watching the hallway, had pulled himself upright against the raised section of the bed into something closer to sitting, which made him look briefly like the man I had spent 15 years across a kitchen table from, rather than the one I had found unconscious in a hospital at midnight. The documents were still spread across the sheet in front of him. The 12th page of the transcript rested face up on top, slightly askew from where he had set it down. He looked at me when I came back through the doorway. Vivian. His voice had recovered some of its texture as the analgesic wore further. It sounded more like him than it had an hour ago. I didn't know whether that was easier or harder to hear. I didn't know what she was planning to. I know you didn't, I said. I set my bag on the chair and stayed standing. I know you didn't know about the insurance policy. That is the only reason you're not in handcuffs tonight. I paused. Not sentiment. Evidence. Reed documented what you did and didn't know. That documentation matters. He received this without the reframe or the counter-argument or the strategic pivot I had watched him apply in professional contexts for 15 years. Whatever the salesman in Preston Caldwell had been doing all evening, it had gone quiet sometime around the transcript. What was sitting in the bed in front of me was doing something I had not seen from him in a long time, simply receiving what was true without managing it. Vivian. He was choosing his next words with visible care, which was more than I had expected. Do you think we could possibly— I reached into my bag, not for an envelope. There was nothing left in the envelopes, and Preston had read everything there was to read. What I was reaching for had been in the outer pocket of my bag since I had packed it 2 days ago at the kitchen table, placed there separately from the documents, because it was not a document. I had known on some level that did not require conscious articulation that I would need it tonight. Not as evidence, not as a weapon. As the only true thing I had left to give him that he did not already have. A photograph. The most recent one from Dr. Harmon's office from my 29th week appointment, the one I had attended alone because Preston had a meeting he said he could not move, and I had stopped asking him to. Standard grayscale ultrasound print, the kind that looks like abstraction until you understand what you are looking at, and then looks like everything. I placed it on the sheet between us. Not in his hands. Between us. That's James, I said. Preston looked at the photograph. James, he said, quietly, as though testing the name for weight, for fit for the particular reality of a thing that has existed in someone else's private world and has now entered the shared one. His iron levels are low, I said. His ferritin has been below the normal range for gestational age since the 28th week, witch doctor. Harmon attributed to my diet because neither of us had any reason to believe the supplements I was taking each morning weren't working. My voice stayed even, clinical. This was the moment for information, not for anything else. They weren't working. Someone had replaced them. 4 months of placebos. His neurological development markers are within normal range. Dr. Harmon confirmed that at the most recent appointment. He will need supplemental iron after delivery. There will be monitoring. A breath. He's here. He's strong. He is going to be fine. I watched Preston look at the photograph of his son. There is a specific way that a person's face changes when they look at an image of their unborn child in the context of understanding what nearly happened to that child. I recognized the movement of it because I had felt something structurally similar myself sitting at Reed's desk in September, when the preliminary lab analysis came back, and I spent 30 seconds alone with what it meant before I began deciding what to do about it. The particular reorganization of a person's features when abstract love becomes specific and terrified, and retroactive. Preston's mouth moved. No sound came. Then his shoulders shifted and his jaw set, and whatever he had been managing for the past 2 hours, the controlled reception of information, the salesman's habit of staying in the room, the particular discipline of a man trying to hold himself together in the presence of the woman he had failed, most stopped being manageable. I turned away. I want to be precise about why. Behind me, I could hear his breathing change the particular unevenness of someone fighting something that has decided not to be fought. I did not watch it. Not because I was being deliberate about withholding comfort, though comfort was not something I had available for him. Not because I felt nothing. I felt a great deal, a layered, complicated accumulation of things that I had not yet named and was not sure I would need to. But none of it was shaped for Preston Caldwell at 2 in the morning in a hospital room. What I had grieved for this marriage, I had grieved months earlier alone in a parking garage in September, 30 seconds in my car with the engine running and the radio off. Everything I permitted myself before I drove home and made dinner, and continued to be the woman I had decided I was going to be. The work of grief had already been done. What remained was only the formal conclusion. I had delivered it. We were finished. I picked up my bag from the chair, pressed my palm once briefly to the side of my abdomen, James steady present exactly where he had been all night, and walked to the door. Reed was in the doorway. He had moved from his position in the corridor with the quiet efficiency of a man who knows how to read the moment from a distance and arrive at exactly the right one. "Ready?" he asked. I took a breath. Full deliberate all the way down. "I have one more thing to say first," I said. "I am not a woman who needs the last word. I have gone through most of my adult life perfectly content to let other people have it, because I learned early that the person who speaks last in a conversation is not always the person who has spoken most effectively. Restraint applied correctly carries further than volume, but there are exceptions." The corridor was empty at this end, Nurse Dempsey on her rounds elsewhere. The Wing C night reduced to the quiet machinery of monitoring and the distant murmur from the nursing station at the far intersection. I walked out of Bay 14 and turned right, toward the alcove near the Wing C exit, where Detective Greer had established a temporary processing position. Standard preliminary intake officer, present tablet open, the first formal steps before transport and booking. Celeste was seated in a plastic chair that had been brought from the nurse's station, her wrists secured in front of her. Her posture, the same deliberate uprightness I had observed in the hallway 20 minutes before. Greer saw me coming. He said something to his officer, then took 3 measured steps in my direction, not blocking, but establishing an intercept that made clear this approach was being managed rather than happened upon. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said low, "I can give you 1 minute. Personal, not evidentiary. She doesn't have to respond to anything." "She won't," I said. He stepped aside. I covered the last 20 feet at the same pace I had maintained since 11:47. Not hurrying, not performing. There is a quality of attention in a space like that, the officer's practiced neutrality, the overhead light running its fluorescent indifference, and I moved through it without adjusting to it. Celeste looked at me when I arrived. Her chin was level. The expression was not the cold, predatory clarity I had seen in the hallway during the arrest, nor the micro-expression that had moved through her face when I said Karen's name. It was something more contained than either. The expression of a person who has lost the game and has made the decision out of discipline or out of sheer habit to go down without giving the winner the satisfaction of watching them break. I respected it in the way you can respect something without having any sympathy for the person displaying it. You chose the wrong family, I said. I kept my voice at ordinary volume. The corridor was quiet enough that it didn't need to be anything else. You spent 18 months studying us, planning every detail, which building, which floor, which neighborhood association meeting, which recipe to bring to my door. 18 months of preparation. I paused. And you missed one thing. I let the pause take its time. I had been watching you since August. Nothing from Celeste. Her jaw held. Her eyes stayed where they were, but her hands, I noticed, shifted very slightly in her lap, an involuntary adjustment. The body doing what the face had been trained not to do. Karen sends her regards, I said. There it was. Small, fast gone before most people would have caught it. A micro-expression, the kind that lives below the threshold of conscious control. In the layer of a person where all the real responses happen before they can be managed. Not remorse, recognition. The recognition of someone who has just understood that the trail she believed she had left no one to follow was in fact a road built in both directions. I turned around and walked back down the corridor. Preston was in the doorway of Bay 14 when I reached it. He had gotten out of the bed, made it as far as the doorframe, in the hospital gown and the grip of a man who is not entirely certain his legs will do what he needs them to without the frame's assistance. His face, when he saw me coming, did the thing I had watched it do several times that evening, assembled itself into an expression that was trying inadequately to close a distance that no expression could close. Vivian. His voice had the specific quality of a man who has very little remaining leverage and knows it. Please. For James, I reached into the outer pocket of my bag. The envelope was standard white letter size, sealed 2 days ago at the kitchen table on an afternoon when Preston was at the dealership, and the house was quiet enough that I could think. I had written the name and address of Gerald Stanton, my divorce attorney, a man who had been building the legal framework for this filing for the past 6 weeks, in the upper left corner, and the word copy below it. So there was no ambiguity about the nature of the document or the number of copies in existence. I placed it against the doorframe at the level of his hands. Not in them. Mr. Stanton will handle everything from this point, I said. He'll contact your attorney of record through proper channels. I paused. Don't call me Preston. Not once. He looked at the envelope, then at me. Not even to. The custodial arrangement for James will be handled through counsel, I said. He will have 2 parents. That doesn't require us to have a marriage. I stepped back from the doorway. The corridor stretched ahead. Same pale walls. Same fluorescent light running its even intervals. Same linoleum that had been carrying the weight of this evening since 12:25. All of it identical to what it had been when I first walked through it. And entirely different. I walked. My legs had been trembling since the alcove, the kind of trembling that settles just behind the knee in the juncture where large muscle meets joint, where sustained tension and adrenaline and the physical reality of being 43 years old and 8 months pregnant and awake at 2 in the morning finally delivers its full accounting. I was acutely aware of each step. I pressed my shoulders back, kept my chin level, and did not look behind me. I am not a woman who looks back. Reed was at the end of the corridor near the exit to the main hospital wing, holding 2 paper cups from the coffee station on the first floor, the kind with the cardboard sleeve, the kind that exist in hospitals at all hours, because the people in them need something warm to hold on to more than they need quality coffee. He handed me the coffee without a word. We walked out together into the Nashville night, and for the first time in 6 months, I felt the full weight of what I had been carrying and the strange, terrifying lightness of having finally set it down. The cold arrived the moment the hospital's heat stopped following us. Not metaphor. Actual cold, the kind that October in Nashville carries at 2 in the morning, the kind that arrives without negotiation and finds every gap in whatever you are wearing, and reminds you, with considerable directness, that the rest of the world has been out here while you were in there. I felt it in my cheeks first, then in my hands, then in the particular quality of the air coming into my lungs. clean, unmediated, the cold of the real world, which has no temperature control, and no cardiac monitors, and no fluorescent panels running at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. There was a bench outside the main entrance. Concrete, which meant it had been absorbing the night's cold for several hours and had considerable reserves to return. I sat on it anyway, because I needed to be still, and because my legs were finished with the pretense of steadiness. Reed sat beside me a careful distance, the kind that respects without retreating, and neither of us spoke. The silence lasted several minutes. I let it. What I was doing sitting there was something I had not permitted myself to do at any point in the preceding 6 months. Not the operational feeling, the controlled reception of difficult information, the calibrated response, the emotion filed away for later processing. I mean, the actual thing. The unmanaged thing. The thing that does not respond to preparation. I was thinking about the 15 years. Not the betrayal I had already spent a great deal of time with that had turned it over and examined it until I understood its full architecture. I was thinking about the other 15 years. The early ones. The first apartment in East Nashville before we had any money, with the radiator that clicked all winter and the kitchen so small that 2 people had to take turns. The year we built the dealership from a single showroom and a lease, we could not quite afford Preston on the phone with banks, while I went through the numbers at the kitchen table until midnight. The particular light through the windows on Sunday mornings when the week had not started yet and the coffee was still brewing, and the future felt like something the two of us were building together and would get to inhabit. Those years had been real. I had decided this before tonight, and sitting on the concrete bench I confirmed it. They had been genuinely, honestly real. What they were not was enough. Not enough insulation against what Preston chose to become, not enough to protect what came after from what was building inside it. The real years and the failed ones had both existed inside the same marriage, and the marriage was over, and what I was sitting with on this bench was the part that no amount of preparation addresses. The simple human weight of a thing that was real and is now done. I was not crying. I want to note this not because it is a virtue, but because it is true. The grief was present, sitting in my chest in the way that genuine grief does. Unhurried and inconvenient, and entirely unimpressed with the amount of work I had done to arrive at this bench, having accomplished exactly what I set out to accomplish. Grief has no interest in competence. It keeps its own schedule. I looked at my hands on my lap. They had gone very pale. The cup from the hospital coffee station was still in my right hand, and it had gone cold enough that it was no longer helping. Reed noticed before I said anything, which is the correct order in which things happened. He observed specifically, and without comment, that my hands were considerably colder than the air around us, and that the cup in my right hand was no longer providing any thermal assistance. And he shifted his own cup and extended it toward me in the way that people extend things when they have noticed something real and are responding to it, rather than performing generosity. I took it, held it with both hands. The warmth moved through my palms and into my fingers, and I did not have words for how welcome it was. "You did everything right," Reed said. I looked at the middle distance, the amber lights of the West End, the outline of the city's modest skyline, the darkness of the hills beyond it, where Belle Meade sat quiet and prosperous and completely indifferent to what had just concluded inside it. "I know," I said. "That's the part I'm still getting used to." He considered this in the way he considered most things, with the patience of a person who has learned that the space between a statement and a response is not empty. "The assets are locked," he said. "Every joint account, both properties, the automotive group holdings. The emergency financial restraining order was filed this afternoon concurrent with the warrant. Preston cannot move anything without court authorization from this point. The $2.4 million. Frozen. Federal asset forfeiture. The government holds it while the criminal proceedings against Celeste work through the system. That process takes time. Months, possibly more." He paused. "But the civil suit is its own track. Civil court runs independently of the criminal case. Your claim covers health damages, the vitamin tampering property damages, and intentional infliction. The documentation is exceptional, which you are aware of. That proceeding doesn't wait for criminal resolution. It was important to understand the distinction, and I had understood it since September. In the American legal system, a criminal prosecution and a civil lawsuit arising from the same conduct run on separate tracks. The state prosecutes Celeste for her crimes. Vivian Caldwell sues for her damages. The two do not require each other to succeed, and the civil standard of proof preponderance of evidence rather than beyond reasonable doubt meant my case was already, in Reed's careful professional assessment, strong. I looked at the skyline for another moment. 23 years in this city, 15 of them with Preston built into the background of it, into the texture of my understanding of where things were and what they cost, and which streets felt like mine. I was going to learn a new version of Nashville. I had already begun. 3 calls in the morning, I said. I know. He did not consult anything. Stanton at 8, the realtor at 9. A pause. And Karen at 10. She'll want to know it's over. I nodded. Karen, in Collierville, 50 miles east, carrying 6 years of a story that no one had followed until a Tuesday afternoon in September, when I pulled into a parking lot and called the number Reed had found in a public prosecution record. She would pick up on the first ring. I already knew this about her from that one conversation, because she was a woman who had learned to be available for calls she was not sure would come. I would tell her it was over, that it had ended the way it was supposed to end, with evidence, with a warrant. With Angela Marsh sitting in a plastic chair in a hospital wing having her rights read to her. That would be enough to tell her. Sometimes enough is precisely the right amount. Then we're done for tonight, I said. Reed picked up his coffee. For tonight, he said, as though the morning were already visible from where we were sitting. Which in a manner of speaking it was. I drove home alone. The same 11 miles, a different woman. I-44. Oh, at 3 in the morning is a different road than it is at midnight. The amber and white moving lines of the drive 4 hours earlier reduced to occasional trucks, and the steady marking of overhead lights, the city having finished most of what it intended to do with Friday evening and returned itself to quiet. I kept both hands on the wheel. The radio stayed off. There was nothing I needed to hear that wasn't already inside the car. Belle Meade received me the way old money neighborhoods receive returning residents in the small hours, without ceremony and without question. The magnolias along the main drive were past what they would do for the season, and the streetlights gave the familiar streets that amber suspension that makes known things look like photographs of themselves present, slightly flattened, lit from a source you cannot quite locate. The house was dark. I had left in a hurry at 11:47 with a coat and a bag and not a single light left on, because at 11:47 I had not been thinking about what I would find when I came back. I unlocked the side door and stood in the kitchen for a moment without turning anything on. The house smelled like itself, the cedar of the floors, the particular quality of air in a home where someone baked midweek and the trace of it hasn't quite finished departing. I stood in the dark with my keys in my hand and let the familiar smell of the place arrive and do what familiar things do, remind you of everything that has been true here. The good and the complicated and the ordinary all layered in the same air. Then I went upstairs. The nursery was unchanged. I turned on the small lamp in the corner, the one I had chosen specifically for the quality of its light, warm rather than harsh. The kind that makes a room feel inhabited rather than illuminated, and the honey-colored glow came up across the rocker and the bookshelf and the half-finished animal mural on the far wall that Preston's younger sister had started in August and would now need to be completed by someone else, in a different chapter of this room's life. The white onesie was on the armrest of the rocker where I had left it. The embroidery needle was exactly as I had set it down, angled into the fabric at a mid-stroke pause, thread taut, holding the position I had been in when Officer Weston called at 11:47. It had been waiting for me while I drove 11 miles in the dark, walked through an emergency room, sat in a parking garage, watched a warrant executed place divorce papers against a doorframe, and sat on a concrete bench in October air with 2 cups of hospital coffee and the weight of 6 months finally disassembled. I sat in the rocker. I picked it up. 2 letters remained. James. 5 letters in pale blue thread on white cotton. The kind of blue I had spent an afternoon tracking down across 3 fabric stores in September because the obvious shades were not quite right, and I was not prepared to settle for almost right when it came to his name. The first 3 letters were already done. The needle had gone into the upstroke of the fourth, the E, when my phone rang. I threaded it through the continuation. It took 40 minutes. I did not hurry. The house held its quiet the way houses hold quiet at 3 in the morning when they are in the middle of becoming something different. Not empty, simply suspended, waiting for the shape of what comes next to clarify itself. I worked in the lamp's circle of honey-colored light, and I let myself think about Celeste Drummond. Not the way I had been thinking about her for 6 months, tactically, evidentially, in terms of what could be documented and used and delivered at the correct moment. I thought about the other version, the jar of fig preserves she had brought to my door the first Saturday in September, saying she'd had too many from a friend's farm in Franklin. The way her hand had rested against my belly at the building association fall gathering, warm and apparently genuine, while she said I was going to be a wonderful mother. The Sunday morning in the elevator when she'd held the door for me with both hands and asked in the conversational register of 2 neighbors who have become something resembling friends whether I'd decided on a name. I had told her James. Standing in the elevator of the building where she had chosen her apartment specifically because of our unit's location, I had shared the name I had been keeping close, the name I had been embroidering for weeks. Because she asked warmly. Because I was 8 months along and the name felt real enough to say out loud. She had carried it upstairs and continued planning. What I felt sitting in the rocker with the onesie in my hands and the needle moving through its last iterations was not the spiked grief that retrospect is sometimes capable of producing. It was something more clarifying and in its own way more disturbing. The specific understanding of a woman who has realized that another person never perceived her as a person at all, not as an adversary to be defeated, not as a victim to be pitied, but simply as a system to work within, a resource to be managed. Celeste had not hated me. She had not thought about me in the ways that require granting another person their full humanity. I was a variable in an equation she had been solving, and that impersonality, that efficient, complete absence of personal feeling was its own category of violation, one that no document or transcript had been able to fully capture. I completed the last letter, drew the thread through, knotted the back cleanly the way my grandmother had taught me, the way I had been doing since I was 9 years old. I held the onesie up under the honey-colored lamp. James, white cotton, pale blue thread. 5 letters that had been 4 for 4 hours and 32 minutes while I was occupied with making sure the world he was about to enter into was safer than the one I had found when I started looking. My hands had been steadier than I expected. This was the thing that struck me most sitting there at 3:40-something in the morning with the finished onesie in my lap. All the steadiness I thought I had been performing turned out in the end to have been real. Then I cried. For the first time all night, not the collapsed kind, not the kind that announces itself and demands attention and produces aftermath. A quieter version, brief, honest, and involuntary. The sound of something that had been building since before the phone rang at 11:47, and perhaps, since considerably before that, finally completing its release. Not pain. Not grief for Preston. Not grief for the marriage. Not grief for the 15 years. Though all of those were present in the room with me. The crying was what crying is when it comes at the end of something very long and very difficult relief. The particular sound of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has set it down and has finally allowed their body to acknowledge the weight of it. It did not last long. I did not need it to. I set the onesie on the armrest, pressed the back of my hand to my face, sat in the rocker for another few minutes in the honey-colored light, listening to the house hold its quiet around me, until I was ready. When I finally lay down, James shifted a long, slow rotation beneath my ribs, the movement of a child finding a better position, adjusting to the new geography of a quieter world. "We're okay," I said, out loud to the ceiling, to the small person turning in the space below my heart. "The two of us. We're going to be fine." I almost believed it then. By morning, I believed it entirely. There is a particular clarity that arrives after a sleepless night, not the pleasant kind, not rested or refreshed. The other kind. The kind where everything unnecessary has been burned off by the hours, and what remains in the morning light is the unpadded version of what is actually true. I had been awake for more than 11 hours by the time I made the first call. At 8 o'clock, I called Gerald Stanton. The conversation took 14 minutes. Stanton had already reviewed the materials. Reed had sent everything the previous afternoon. The filing was ready. The emergency financial restraining order was in force. The divorce petition would be served at the office of Preston's attorney of record, not his hospital room. We had agreed on this the previous week. Serving a man in a hospital bed created procedural complexity, and Preston Caldwell was perfectly capable of receiving the appropriate documentation through the appropriate channels once he was back on his feet. "My instructions going forward," I said. "No negotiation, only execution." "Understood," Stanton said. At 9 o'clock, I called the Green Hills realtor. The apartment was still available. I had held it the previous Wednesday when the warrant timeline was confirmed. We agreed on Tuesday for the lease signing. I had moved the relevant funds into my personal account in April on Reed's advice, which I was now understanding had been even more prescient than it felt at the time. "We'll have the keys ready," the realtor said, with the warm cadence of someone whose job is making transitions feel like beginnings. In this case, I did not find it false. At 10 o'clock, I called Karen. She picked up on the first ring. "Karen Hall," I said. "It's over. She was arrested last night. She's in custody." The silence that followed was the longest I had waited through all morning. The silence of a woman who has lived with something unresolved for 6 years and has just been told it has been given a name and a room and a proceeding. "Was anyone—" she started. "No," I said. "My son is fine. We're both fine." "Your son," she said. Something in those two words told me she was thinking about the child she had lost in the 7th month, the parallel she had spent years trying not to draw too directly. "What's his name?" "James," I said. A pause. Shorter. "That's a good name," she said. There is no adequate compression of what passed between us in the rest of that call, what was communicated in the space between sentences. In the names of children who had different outcomes, because one of them had a mother who had been paying attention in time. What I will say is that when Karen said thank you, she was not thanking me for the arrest. She was thanking me for finding her, for making the call in September, for ensuring that the Memphis chapter of Angela Marsh's story was not the last one. The weeks that followed moved with the rhythm of legal proceedings, deliberate, measured. The charges against Celeste Drummond, entered formally under the name Angela Marsh, were substantial. Conspiracy to commit financial fraud, identity fraud across state lines, activating federal jurisdiction under 18 U.S.C. Section 1028, and a charge Reed had flagged as available, but wasn't certain the DA would pursue: aggravated assault of a pregnant woman, arising from the knowing substitution of prenatal supplements with inert placebos over 4 consecutive months, causing documented nutritional deficiency in both mother and unborn child. The DA reviewed the lab analysis, the timeline, the copied key, the identical packaging, and pursued it. Bail was denied at the preliminary hearing. The judge cited 2 factors: the 2 passports recovered from apartment 4F, and the $2.4 million in bundled cash, documented evidence of both the financial means and the stated intention to leave the jurisdiction. Angela Marsh was remanded to custody pending trial. She entered her not guilty plea and did not otherwise speak. Preston's situation was more complicated and, in its specific way, more fitting. The criminal investigation had established his role as an instrument rather than a co-conspirator. So he was not facing criminal charges. What he was facing was a civil financial investigation triggered by the asset transfer documentation, the suspension of his operational authority over both dealership locations by the business's co-investors pending review, and the formal service of divorce papers on the Thursday of the second week. His attorney called Stanton's office within 48 hours. Preston himself did not call. I had told him not to, and he had chosen to honor the one clear instruction I'd given him. I signed the Green Hills lease on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of October. Fourth floor off Hillsborough Pike. Southeast-facing windows that caught the afternoon light in a way I had noted during the walk-through and kept with me. It smelled of fresh paint and new carpet, and the particular quality of air that exists in a space before anyone has lived there, uncommitted, open, waiting for whoever arrives to determine what it becomes. I stood in the center of the empty living room and turned slowly in a full circle. This was mine, only mine. I had not had something that was only mine in 15 years. The realization arrived the way the most consequential ones tend to, not dramatically, not announced, but quietly, like a key turning in a lock that has been fitted and waiting. I signed the final page, shook hands with the building manager, took the keys. Then I drove to a furniture store on 8th Avenue South and bought a crib. Rebuilding does not look heroic. I want to be clear about this, because the word carries implications that don't match the reality of a Tuesday night in late October, with the assembly instructions for a crib spread across the hardwood floor of my Green Hills apartment. A hex wrench in my hand and one specific screw that had decided with genuine and sustained commitment that it was not going to cooperate. The instructions were in Swedish first and English second, illustrated by diagrams designed, I can only assume, by someone who had never attempted furniture assembly in their 8th month of pregnancy at 11 in the evening. There were 17 steps. Step 9 contained a note in small, bold font, recommending the assistance of a second adult. I read it, acknowledged it, and proceeded. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The screw eventually cooperated. The crib stood. I sat on the hardwood floor and looked at what I had built, white frame slats at the correct distance, mattress platform at the appropriate height, and I thought about the fact of it. These hands had built this, in this specific room at 1:45 on a Tuesday. Not because there was no other option. I could have hired someone. I could have asked Reed, who would have come without making it into something it wasn't. I chose to build it myself because some things need to be constructed by the person who will be responsible for everything that happens inside them. The following Saturday I painted. The color was called Drift of Mist, a gray that sits on the warm side of neutrally. The shade that doesn't announce itself but makes everything inside the room feel as though someone made a considered decision about it. I had seen it in a design magazine in Dr. Harmon's waiting room in September and taken a photograph of the page, which I had filed alongside the floor plan measurements and the realtor's contact number under a folder I had created on my phone called simply New Apartment. Painting at 8 months pregnant requires a certain renegotiation with ladders. I kept to the lower 2 steps. I used a long-handled roller for the upper sections and accepted that proximity was no longer one of my available tools. I worked in quadrants, moved the drop cloth in stages, and took breaks when James repositioned himself in ways that made bending forward inadvisable. By late afternoon, 3 walls were done. The 4th followed on Sunday morning. There was a paint smear on the left side of the window frame, a thin curved arc where the roller had caught the trim at an angle I hadn't anticipated. I looked at it for a moment, considered taping the frame and doing a corrective coat, assessed the amount of time and energy that would require, and decided against it. It would stay. The room had been made by human hands and it should look like it. Over the following weeks, in the specific quiet of the Green Hills apartment, a quiet that felt different from the Belle Meade house, less weighted, more forward-facing, I completed what needed completing. A bookshelf from storage, its contents arranged in the order I had always intended and never had the walls for. A small armchair I found at an estate sale in Sylvan Park. upholstered by the seller's daughter in a fabric that happened to match the drift of mist walls in a way I could not have planned, and that felt, in the superstitious way that tired pregnant women sometimes feel, things like confirmation that the room was becoming what it was supposed to be. The white onesie with the pale blue embroidery hung on a hook beside the window, James's name in the room before James himself. No object in this apartment had come from the Belmead house with Preston's hands on it. I had arranged this deliberately, with the full understanding that a genuine beginning requires a certain clarity about what crosses the threshold and what does not. What was here was chosen in these weeks for this specific life. Reed called on a Wednesday afternoon with a civil suit update. Preston had provided his deposition the previous week, a formal statement to Reed's litigation team, documenting what he had signed, what he had been told, and what he had not understood. His attorneys had negotiated a cooperation framework in exchange for truthful testimony, corroborating the recording evidence and the documentary trail. The civil damages claim against Preston personally would be addressed at a negotiated figure rather than pursued to maximum exposure. He would still pay. The amount simply would not be the largest available number. He was more forthcoming than I expected, Reed said. He has a son now, I said. Or he's beginning to understand that he does. There was a pause on Reed's end that told me he had considered a response and elected not to make it. Celeste formally, Angela Marsh in every proceeding had maintained her not guilty plea through the arraignment. Her public defender had indicated a challenge to the admissibility of certain evidence, which Reed considered a standard and ultimately unproductive motion, given the recording's solid legal foundation under Tennessee's one-party consent statute. The email documentation, the insurance record, the lab analysis, the Memphis medical history, all of it had been preserved with the kind of precision that makes evidentiary challenges expensive in attorney hours and unlikely in outcome. The DA's office was proceeding with confidence. She has a difficult road ahead, Reed said. Yes, I said. She does. By the last Sunday of October, the nursery was finished. I stood in the doorway in the late afternoon, when the light came through the southeast windows at the angle I had specifically chosen this apartment for warm long, the kind of gold that arrives in October and makes things look more considered than they sometimes are. I looked at the crib, the armchair, the bookshelf with its contents in the right order finally after years of being in whatever order circumstances had left them. The stenciled letters above the crib that I had applied on the last Thursday of October freehand, not quite perfectly level, and had decided were level enough. The paint smear on the window frame that I had decided to keep. Nothing in this room was perfect. It had been built in the human way, incrementally, imperfectly, by a woman in the final weeks of her pregnancy who did not always take doctor. Harmon's advice about how much rest was appropriate because some things cannot wait for the appropriate amount of rest. Doctor Harmon had flagged the worsening back pain at my 34th week appointment with the particular tone of someone who knows they are speaking to a patient who will listen, absorb, and then continue doing what she was doing. I had been doing exactly that. Real things are built imperfectly. That is what makes them real. It's real, I said to the room, to the name above the crib, to the small person who would inhabit it in approximately 3 weeks. And it belongs to us. Reed called on a Thursday evening. The civil suit has a new development, he said. Can I come Saturday? Bring coffee, I told him. There was a pause, the particular pause of a person who is about to ask a clarifying question. I answered it before he could. I'll be home. Reed appeared at 9:15 on Saturday morning with 2 coffees, a wooden box under his arm, and the expression of a man who has been holding good news long enough that delivering it has become a genuine relief. I was on the sofa with a throw blanket and a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm. I had been awake since 6. My lower back had opinions about the previous week's painting project that it was still. 11 days later, clearly articulating, "You look exhausted," Reed said factually, not unkindly. "Come in," I said. He set the wooden box on the coffee table and opened it. Inside organized with the precision I had come to recognize as simply how Reed Calloway kept things he considered important. Were the settlement documents. Preston's attorneys accepted the final terms yesterday afternoon, he said. $1.8 million directed into an irrevocable trust in James's name. Not to you, to the trust. Neither of you can access the principal without court approval until James reaches adulthood. It is clean documented, and from the moment the transfer clears, it is his. Where does that sit relative to the government's forfeiture? Completely separate tracks. Reed confirmed. The $2.4 million from the Gulch apartment moves through federal asset forfeiture tied to Angela Marsh's criminal proceedings. The civil settlement with Preston has no bearing on that. You weren't waiting for the forfeiture. You were running parallel. I was running parallel, I said. The civil suit had been prepared quietly through Stanton's office since the first week of October, while the criminal investigation was building, while the recording evidence was being analyzed. While everything else assembled itself into the shape it needed to be, 2 tracks simultaneously, because that is how people who have been paying attention operate. I read the first page. $1.8 million into James's trust. Effective upon Preston's signature obtained the previous afternoon at Stanton's office, both attorneys present. In a room I had not needed to be in. I set it back in the box and closed the latch. 3 days later, James arrived. November 12th, 2024. A Tuesday. The labor began at 2:14 in the morning. The real kind, unmistakable, the body shifting registers in a way that cannot be misread. I called my sister. She met me at the Vanderbilt entrance 40 minutes later. The same entrance I had walked through at 12:25 on October 12th. The same automatic doors, the same institutional air, the same hospital, a different wing, a different purpose, an entirely different version of what arriving here meant. In October, I had come with 4 envelopes and a plan. In November, I came with nothing but the fact of it, which turned out to be sufficient. 11 hours. At 1:18 in the afternoon, in a delivery room on the 4th floor of the Vanderbilt Women's Center, James Caldwell entered the world at 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with a full set of opinions about the transition communicated at considerable volume. Healthy, loud, here. When the nurse placed him on my chest, that first contact, the specific weight and warmth of a person who has existed inside you for 9 months and is now impossibly outside, I cried. The second time in this story. Not the brief quiet release of 3 in the morning with embroidery in my lap. Something that came from a place I had not had access to in longer than I could calculate. Not pain. The specific, overwhelming relief of a woman who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and has finally arrived at the place she was carrying it toward. His name was already chosen. James. My father's name, the man who raised me in a household where love was not conditional on compliance, who showed me by consistent example what it looked like when a person who loved you simply did not let you down. The only man of whom I had been able to say that sentence permanently, without revision. James. 7 pounds and 4 ounces. His iron levels were low as expected, documented, and already discussed with the neonatal team. Manageable. Already being managed. He would be fine, because I had spent 6 months making sure of it. Reed was at the door of the recovery room at 4 o'clock. He held a small bunch of wildflower zinnias and something yellow, the informal kind, from the stand outside the grocery store, which was exactly the right choice. In his other hand, a folded piece of paper. I read the note while James slept. Welcome, James. Your mother is the strongest person I've ever known. 4 words beyond necessary, also exactly enough. I looked out the window at Nashville in November, the trees along West End releasing the last of their color, the afternoon light going long and amber, the Cumberland returning whatever the sky offered. I had been born in this hospital 43 years ago. My son had just been born in it. James stirred against my chest. Settled. His breathing was the slow, unconflicted breathing of a person who has recently arrived and has not yet been asked to worry about any of it. I thought about the white onesie. 5 letters in pale blue thread completed at 3 in the morning with steadier hands than I expected. The needle in the fabric on the upstroke of the E at 11:47, and the 4 hours and 32 minutes that passed before I picked it up again, and everything that happened inside those hours. My revenge was never a plan. It was a promise made to myself in a parking garage in September in 30 seconds before I drove home that I would not become a ghost in my own life, not a name in someone else's scheme. Not a woman who made myself smaller to fit a marriage that had been lying about its dimensions for years. The revenge, if you need a word for it, was this: the weight of my son's body against my chest, warm and entirely real. A room built with my own hands in an apartment that belonged to no one but us. The certainty documented, legally established that every person who had looked at Vivian Caldwell and calculated her to be manageable was now living with the precise and compounding cost of that calculation. And James, breathing. That was enough. That was in fact everything. If there is one lesson this family betrayal taught me, it is that the truth given time and preparation always finds the light. Family revenge is not something I ever planned. It was a promise. I believe God placed those 30 seconds of silence in my life, not to break me, but to ask what I was made of. My advice from someone who has survived family betrayal from the inside: don't wait until everything is falling apart to understand your own worth. Don't be like me, carrying it alone for 6 months in silence. Tell someone. Trust the right people earlier. Never mistake warmth for honesty. Family revenge is not something I would wish on anyone. It is exhausting in ways no legal document can capture. What I would wish for every person who has experienced family betrayal is simply the clarity to know what they deserve before someone else decides for them. Family revenge begins the moment you choose not to be a variable in someone else's equation. And family revenge ends the moment you realize you were never supposed to be one. That decision is yours alone. If this story stayed with you, comment, share, and subscribe. Every word you leave means someone else gets to hear this story too. Thank you for staying until the very end. Stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted to explore real human truths. If that's not your content, no judgment. But if you're staying, I'll see you in the next one.
And that's where the story reaches its end. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen. I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would, but pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger. Now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection, now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. So keep your sympathy behind you, I don't need what's left undone. Sometimes losing who once broke you is how healing has begun. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone